Hey everybody, my name is Dustin Schmidt. I'm a photographer and DP here in Oklahoma City. And today I want to talk about the Canon R5c and the Canon C200 and why maybe you might consider the Canon C200 here in 2023. So let's check it out. So the Canon R5c and the Canon C200 are two very different cameras. One's relatively new, just came out in the last year and a half or so, and then one's several years old at this point, the Canon C200. And they do different things, right? One's a hybrid, shoots stills and video, and then one is purely a cinema camera. So you probably wouldn't be looking at these two cameras to accomplish the same goals. But if you want to shoot video with both of them, like I do, I wanted to see how do those two cameras stack up against each other. And really, does the C200 still hold up today in 2023 against some other cameras that have some newer tech? Now, I've looked at a lot of new cinema cameras that have come out in the last couple of years since I've had my C200. I bought my C200 a few years ago, and it had already been on the market for a few years at that point. And I bought it mostly because of the RAW codec that it had. If you wanted to shoot RAW at the time when the Canon C200 came out, there weren't as many options as there are today. Now there's a lot of hybrid cameras that will shoot RAW to a recorder, like an Atomos recorder. Almost anything that comes out nowadays has some sort of ProRes RAW or Blackmagic RAW that it can shoot to some of these recorders. But I didn't want a camera that I had to have this extra thing to get to RAW. The thing that always appealed to me about the C200 was that all you needed was a CFast card and you could shoot RAW direct into the body. So it kept things less complicated. And the less complications, the better when it comes to being on set and just getting the work done. But one of the big challenges when the C200 first came out was file sizes and also dealing with the codec, because it wasn't a very compressed codec. And in fact, I don't know how much compression it has at all. It's a pretty big file. And computers kind of struggled with it at the time. But as technology here has advanced and Apple's come out with some of their, M1 and M2 chips, it can handle the RAW a lot better than it used to. In fact, I would argue that now is kind of the sweet spot for having a C200 because you can really edit it natively, on an M1 MacBook Pro, which is what I use to do all my editing on. And it plays back very smoothly in there at full res, full quality, all that kind of stuff. So that's fantastic. It finally gives you access to some of those benefits of RAW in terms of the capability to push it around in post, and it doesn't make it so hard to work with in post. Now the file sizes are still big, but if you're willing to account for that and have the storage, there's some ways around that. So those were some pluses for the C200. But like anybody, I see the things that are out there and I get that kind of gearhead kind of lust for whatever the new thing is that comes out. I've spent a lot of time looking at, cameras from Red, like the Komodo, like some of the older models, the DSMC2 stuff that is now selling cheaper because of the new DSMC3, like the Komodo, like the Raptor. A lot of people are offloading their old Reds that you can get now for still a decent amount of money, but cheaper than it used to be for sure. Blackmagic is always a consideration if you want to talk about RAW, and people love the Blackmagic RAW codec. I have never been a giant fan. I haven't spent a ton of time shooting with Blackmagic, mostly because of the autofocus. Something you could also say against the Red, but I shoot a lot with Canon cameras. I have for a long time, and a lot of that is because of the autofocus. It's great for talking heads. It's great for single operators. It's great for speed. There's a lot of benefits to that. And you've seen a lot of camera manufacturers implementing that. Sony's amazing. Sony and Canon are always kind of right there. Panasonic just came out with their new autofocus on the S5 II that is light years ahead of what they had. And even Red has autofocus on the Komodo and the Raptor, I believe. So it definitely is the wave of the future for ease of use and for speed. So starting with our Canon C200 footage, I'm just going to roll the footage through all the way so you can take a look. and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit about at least what I think I saw, and you can make your own judgments as well. So all this stuff is labeled and slated, as you'll see on the footage, but a little bit about what you're going to see. We're going to have our base ISO down at the bottom on all these, and then our corrected footage up top. So what we were trying to do is basically bring that footage back in line with our base footage, and try to align the waveforms on those two. So that's how I treated this test. There's also a white card. When I say white card, it's just some white paper that I had sitting over on the side. That is probably at about an 85% luminance value on the base setting. I did not have a color chart for this. I used to have a color chart and I can't find it. So I guess it's time to get a new one. So you're not going to see any color chart in here. You will see there's some colors on the slate at the beginning if you want to compare that. But mostly what I'm looking at here is skin tones, just to see how well those hold up and the image as a whole. So here we are at base ISO. We're at shooting the C-Log 2 in the RAW. And I say C-Log 2 because this is all processed as C-Log 2. Technically the C200 is supposed to only shoot C-Log 3, but I process it in C-Log 2 all the time. Once you get into DaVinci, you can set it however you want on the curve. ISO 800, 4550 on the Kelvin, and it's the 4096 by 2160. So here we are at 0. This is one stopover, and then brought back down and normalized to our base here. And you can see it looks almost identical, and everything's holding up real well. Here we are at 2 stops over. I would say 2 stops over was almost identical as well. We still hadn't clipped anything. Everything was looking good. Even our white card was still holding really well in the waveform on this. Now, when we got to 3 stops over, that white card did start to clip. We had lost some information there. But you can see that the skin tones are fantastic. They're still holding up great. And then 4 stops over, it's kind of the same deal. We've lost our highlights here. But again, the skin tones and the backdrop and all that are still holding up fantastically. So I would say that you could go 4 stops over here on the C200 and skin tones and all that would be totally fine. I would not do that if you're trying to protect your highlights, you're outside, you've got skies, things like that. But for an interview, it's totally doable. Still, expose where you need to, but that's interesting on the latitude here. Now we're going under, 1 stop under, still looking pretty good. Not too noisy, maybe a little bit of noise. I think you could just kind of call it grain still at this point, but it's doable. You could do it this way. Now 2 stops under, we've seen a little change here. You can see us going a little bit green. The noise is really picking up here. But skin tones are okay. Again, you could get away with it with some noise reduction and trying to pull some of that green out. All I've really done on these is normalize it to the standard Canon wide DR Rec 709. I did not push around a bunch of stuff. I just wanted to see what does this look like with dropping the Canon standard LUT on this footage. There's also no noise reduction run on any of this at the moment. Now when we get to 3 stops, I think it's too far gone. The background, there's a lot of color noise being introduced. It does not look good. Just noise everywhere. And at 4 stops, you're not coming back from this. So, in fact, the camera was having a really hard time just trying to find focus at 4 stops under. So general thoughts on C200 and shooting the RAW is it's going to work really well within that range, right? Of exposing properly, 60% Luma kind of on the face, and then you could go 4 stops over if you wanted to and still hold those skin tones. So in a controlled lighting situation like interview lighting, it gives you a lot of leeway. As you start to go under and this sensor gets starved for light, 2 stops under, you're really pushing it. You're going to have to apply a little bit of noise reduction. You're going to have to do a little more color correction, but it's probably a savable image. 3 and 4 stops under, no, don't do it. You will not be hired back if you end up shooting that far. But pretty good results. Like the RAW holds up pretty well. You can push it around, and it's just nice to see that latitude and how this image responds to light on the C200. So, okay, I want to roll the R5c 4K all-eye 10-bit footage. Let's check that footage out, and then we'll come back and talk about that. Here's the R5c XFAVC. And the XFAVC is 10-bit. So I think that's interesting to note because all the other codecs we're going to look at are 12-bit. I think you can definitely tell. As well as it's the only non-RAW codec that we're shooting here. So 0 looks really good. Everything's holding up, obviously. As we go to 1 stopover and normalize that, I would say still looking pretty good. Not too big of a difference in the image. 2 stops over, same thing. This is kind of what we've seen on the Canon cameras, is within the regular range and 2 stops over, you're not going to see much of a difference. You're going to be able to pull everything back kind of where you need to. And we've still got some of our white here. Now 3 stops over, we've clipped our whites just like we have. I think one of the big things I've noticed on the XFAVC here is there's not as much subtlety here in the transitions. And I think that's due to our 10-bit versus our 12-bit. So this image still looks good, but you can see it's way more contrasty than our standard. And then 4 stops over, the skin's starting to clip a little bit. Contrast is way overdone. We don't have that subtlety and that tonality there, so not quite as good. Now when we go under, immediately when we go 1 stop under on the XFAVC, I don't think it looks as good as it should. We brought it back. It seems kind of milky. Again, this is just with the standard applied, but it's not holding up quite as well as I would hope. 2 stops under, we've lost a lot of contrast here. Everything's just kind of flattened out. It's not very noisy though, is the key thing. You could definitely push some more contrast back in here, but and this is just that when you're not shooting RAW and it's applying that noise reduction, it helps with the noise, but the image isn't quite as good. As we go to 3 stops under, you can just see this massive flattening out of the image. Still not very noisy, but this isn't an image that I'd be terribly happy with. And then 4 stops under, it's just like a big gray mess, which is kind of nuts. So definitely not a usable image here at 4 stops under. And I think you'll see that throughout all these. Okay, now I want to roll the R5c 5.9K Super 35 RAW at ISO 800. Let's check that footage out, and then we'll come back and talk about it. All right, now looking at the 6K RAW out of the R5c. And again, things are looking really good. All the way through the normal, 1 stop over, same thing, bringing that down, it looks great. Two stops over, same thing. We've got nice gradations through the shadows. Everything's coming back. Highlights are still there. 3 stops over, kind of saw the same thing. The highlights are clipping at 3 stops over, but the skin tones still look great. 4 stops over, same thing. Skin tones are still holding up. Transitions from light to dark are holding up. Shadows look good, but the whites are clipped. As we go into our 1 stop under, same thing, it's still looking good. A little bit of noise, but it's holding up. Kind of like our C200. I think the images are very comparable here. 2 stops under, same thing. We're introducing more noise now, but the noise looks better than it did on the C200, I would say. And there's less color shift at 2 stops under. It's a little grayer here, less grain being introduced. 3 stops under, the noise is really kind of jumping in there. But again, it still looks better than the C200 at 3 stops under noise-wise. So I'd say we're getting a better image out of the 5.9K, ISO 800 Super 35 RAW here. And then at 4 stops under, again, it's too dark, very noisy, but more monochromatic noise, less color shift still. But 4 stops under is too far. We're having trouble focusing. I wouldn't be shooting this. But overall, the 5.9K Super 35 RAW out of the R5c is a better image than the C200. And now I want to roll the Canon R5c ISO 3200, so the high base ISO 5.9K Super 35 RAW. Let's check that footage out and we'll come back and talk about it. Now here's an interesting one. When we went to the high base 3200, and I'm just going to kind of go through this the same way, but to kick it off, I would say it looks nearly as good as the 800. I did not see a big difference in this image. And so 1 stop over, same thing, brings back, normalizes really well. 2 stops over, same thing we've seen throughout these Canon RAW tests, still looks good. Whites are still there. 3 stops over, we've kind of clipped our whites at this point. But the skin tones still look great. And 4 stops over, same thing. Skin tones look good, whites are gone, but there's really no noise. Color shift's pretty good, pretty solid, and this would totally hold up. 1 stop under, we're still looking pretty good here. Noise is not that bad. There's a little bit, but it's not going too crazy on us. At 2 stops under, we've introduced quite a bit of noise, but this is the high base 3200, and it still looks really good. Not much color shift. 3 stops under, same thing, cleaner image, more modern image than the C200. Holds up really well to the base 800 that the R5c has. And then 4 stops, way too noisy, way too much noise. But you can almost bring skin tones and things back, although I wouldn't use this image. So what did we learn here doing these tests? Overall, R5c, it's a better image than the C200. The latitude is about the same. The resolution helps. There's more detail in the 5.9K as you would expect. It's a 4K image versus call it a 6K image. But I don't think you see that in real life. Nobody's viewing on a 6K TV, right? Most of the time, even if you have a 4K TV, that 4K is going to resolve about the same. And most of the time, these outputs are 1080. So I don't think you're going to see a big difference there. Now, the XF AVC of the R5c looks pretty good out of the box. Properly exposed and corrected, looks great. Doesn't take much work. That looks really good. But it doesn't have the latitude that the RAW has. Again, as to be expected. So the Super 35 5.9K RAW looks great. Love the image. It's cleaner than the C200 and a little less color shift as you go into the shadows. But where I would, properly expose this, aside from the resolution difference, I don't know that you're going to see that big of a difference to the normal eye. I mean, unless you're really pixel peeping on this stuff and literally comparing the two side by side, I don't know that it's a big deal, really. The thing that I am enthused by is as we talk about the 3200 ISO, is that holds up really, really well to the 800 ISO. So that means if I'm like inside doing gimbal stuff, crank up the 3200 on the R5c, shooting the RAW, and you're going to get a really great image with a lot less light out of that camera. So that's really encouraging because that's where I primarily use this R5c. I use it as a B cam for interview stuff, but I also use it on the gimbal a lot. I don't want to use the C200 on the gimbal because I don't want to use a big, two-handed Ronin 2 or big Movi. I just want a little one-handed gimbal, and the R5c is great for that. So I think that's where it slots in really well. The C200 is still my A cam at the moment for a lot of reasons. It's a bigger camera overall. So it has more outputs. It's got the SDI built in. It's got HDMI if you need it. It's got the built-in ND filters. It's got onboard audio. That's where a cinema camera like the C200 really shines. It goes on the shoulder a lot easier. You can just rig it and kit it out like a cinema camera should be kitted out. Even though the image is not quite as good as the R5c, when you push it to the limits, that's where you're going to see the difference. Properly exposed, properly lit, you know, even just in a situation where you don't have a ton of control, if you're just outside, if you place the C200 properly, you know, expose it properly, the latitude's there for you to be able to get some highlights back, to push some shadows up. It's totally fine. And this is a camera that's years old at this point. I think I kind of did this test so that I could really see, do I need to buy a new camera? And for me right now, the answer is no. I do not need to get anything newer or better for where my clients sit and what I need out of the image. The C200 is still holding up here in 2023, and the R5c is a great companion to it and a fantastic camera in its own right. So, hey everybody, Future Dustin coming back here. As I was cutting this video together, I wanted to come back and talk a little bit more about what I kind of concluded here. You know, we started out talking about, is the C200 worth it here in 2023? It's a cheesy, you know, thing to ask, right? Like people always ask this. Is X camera from 10 years ago still great today? And universally, the answer is almost always yes, right? The goal for me for doing these tests is really to see how the image on these two cameras stack up, but also, you know, do I really need to get a new camera at this point? Is that what's really going to help me get to this next level? And for the majority of the work I do, it's really not. There's so many other things that could be putting time into in terms of locations, art direction, lighting, you know, talent direction, all those types of things those are going to make the video better, more so than getting an extra stop or half a stop out of dynamic range. So the good news is, if you've got something a little bit older, it's still great. If you want to pick up an older camera to shoot with and save a ton of money, you should go do that. You can get some great bargains that way. And if you bought a modern camera, it's great. Like, the new stuff is fantastic. Use what you have and make great stuff. So hopefully that helps. If you got something out of this video, let me know. Leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.